All right, we split this in half for your convenience, so our new overall topic is the new United States of America Part 2. And our first subtopic is going to be the election of 1792, our second presidential election. We'll go a little more into detail on this. Now kiddos, I'll ask Kaylee this. Do you remember on the way we're electing presidents now that the common person has no say, right? It's going to be done by the electors. And how do they decide who's president and who's vice president? Are they voting for each of those?
Sorry, can I borrow Marcus?
So how are they deciding that? Who's going to be president, who's going to be vice president? They don't vote for president and vice president, they vote for everybody. How do they decide which one's which?
Second place.
Okay, go ahead.
Second place. Vice president.
And the one, well, let's do it in proper order. The person with the most electoral votes is president, and the person with the second most electoral votes is vice president. Well, I'm going to give you all 5 candidates. 5 people ran for president of the United States in 1792. Some names are familiar, some are not. Thomas Jefferson ran for president. You can write that down, but you just kind of get... Your pencil's not working? Oh, you got it. Okay, write this down, kiddo. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson was the guy that decided he wanted to run for president. You've heard of him, right? He was Secretary of State under Washington and his cabinet, right? Well, George Washington decided he would run for re-election. George Washington said he's going to run for re-election. A fellow by the name of Aaron Burr, who's on your ID sheet, also decided that he was going to run for re-election. Aaron Burr. Another person on your ID sheet that decided he was going to run for president in 1792 was George Clinton. George Clinton. I'll repeat these again, so don't panic. And the 5th and final man that decided he would run for the presidency in 1792 was John Adams. Remember, he was serving as vice president at the time under Washington. So, during the election of 1792, 5 different candidates received electoral votes. 5 different ran. You had George Washington, Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Clinton. All 5 of those guys ran for the presidency. The top vote getter is going to be president. The second top vote getter, so to speak, is going to be vice president. So again, Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, George Washington, George Clinton, and John Adams are your 5 candidates. Starting in 5th place with 1 electoral vote was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was in 5th place with 1 electoral vote. This might surprise you. You know who came in second to last? No. Thomas Jefferson only had 4 electoral votes. That's kind of a surprise when you think of the magnitude of him. He finished in 4th. Thomas Jefferson had 4 electoral votes. George Clinton had 50 electoral votes. 50. Did pretty good. Not good enough. George Clinton had 50. John Adams had 77. John Adams had 77. I'll repeat it. And George Washington had 132. So, when the smoke cleared, after the electors went to the polls, the Congress, and voted for President of the United States, George Washington wins with 132 votes. He becomes President of the United States on a re-election. John Adams receives 77 votes and assumes the vice presidency on a re-election, so to speak, although he didn't run for vice president, right? George Clinton is in 3rd with 50. Surprisingly, Thomas Jefferson is in 4th with 4. And Aaron Burr finishes in 5th with 1. So George Washington will now serve a 2nd term as President of the United States, and John Adams will serve as his Vice President. That is the election of 1792. Yes?
So what made them, back when they started this, what made them only want to run for 4 years at a time?
What made it the 4-year thing?
Yeah.
You know, that's a good question. I think that's just what Congress established in the first election. Now, we'll get into this, Donovan, because it's a good question. Is it up until 1952, or excuse me, yeah, no, 56, until 1956, a president could run as many times as he wanted. There were no term limits. That didn't start until, we look at all these presidents, that didn't start until Dwight Eisenhower in 1960, actually. The law was passed. He was elected in 1952. He was elected in 1956, but he couldn't run in 60 because he was the first president that was, kind of hog-tied by the amendment of the Constitution that only limited it to 2 terms. But from Washington all the way down and all the way to here, if you wanted to run for 5 terms, you could. Anybody know the president that was elected to the most terms ever as President of the United States? 4 times.
Wasn't it Lincoln?
No. Lincoln was assassinated, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt was elected to 4 terms as president. 4. Only man in American history to be elected 4 times. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which was the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion. Now, shortly after President Washington was re-elected to a 2nd term, Congress passed a new domestic tax so they could get some money for the federal treasury, right? So shortly after Washington was elected president for the 2nd time, Congress passed a domestic tax to try to get some money into the federal treasury. What's a domestic tax, Cassie? No, domestic, foreign and domestic.
Oh, here?
It's a tax within the United States, okay? They passed a domestic tax. And the reason they passed it, they wanted to get money. You know what they taxed? Whiskey, but we call it distilled liquors, which is whiskey. They taxed distilled liquors. And what would happen is whoever made the whiskey had to pay a tax on every gallon they produced or sold. Okay? So, if Brady Salzman was in the whiskey business, making whiskey, every gallon of whiskey he made, he would have to pay the federal government a tax on that.
How does that work if they're making it for personal consumption also?
Well, you know, Cole, we're going to get into a period of time later in history called the Prohibition.
Yeah.
And if you watch movies like Andy Griffith, you see they're always breaking up the still because they were illegal. Prohibition's different. They made alcohol, liquor absolutely illegal, like drugs.
Yeah.
But anyway, they had to catch them. We're going to get to that. It's a good question. So now, who was maddest about this? What type of individuals were maddest about this new tax? Who made whiskey? Westerners, but what, that's right, Brody, but what specific occupation? What's whiskey made out of? Anybody know?
Farmers.
Okay, farmers. So the ones that were really upset about this whiskey tax were the farmers who lived on the American frontier. This land west of the Appalachian Mountains here was considered frontier. And this is where all the farming was done. People moved over here to farm because the land was better, okay? So all your farmers lived on what they call the western frontier, on lands west of the west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi, in that area I showed you. Now, what's the problem? William, you're a farmer. You're growing all kinds of products. And you have your farm right here. What's going to be your biggest problem in making any money? Well, you're going to produce just a hell of a lot of crops. But what's going to be your problem? Once you produce it, what do you got to do? Well, yeah, you got to sell it. And who are you going to sell it to? Okay, and where are the markets? Are they over here? No, the markets are over here. So somehow they've got to be able to, and this isn't, you don't throw it on an airplane now or put it on a railroad train or put it on a semi-truck. You have to wagon it with mules all the way across over the Appalachians into this area here. So William's got a heck of a farm going. He's got to get all these crops, which take space, and he's got to get them from his frontier farm to eastern markets to sell. So many American farmers turned to the liquor business because it was difficult to transport those regular crops. Pretty easy to put a barrel of whiskey or a bottle of whiskey in a wagon and take it. Couldn't you take a lot more whiskey than you could take ears of corn, so to speak, or peas or whatever? So these American farmers turned to the liquor business because it was too difficult to transport those regular crops to market. They had a lot easier time loading barrels of whiskey on mules and driving them eastward to the markets than they did crops. If you didn't have a wagon, how are you going to put your corn and peas and potatoes on a mule and take them that far? They could strap whiskey barrels, 2 on each side, to their mules and take them to market and make more money that way. So farmers started growing only what? Corn. And they turned that corn into whiskey and they put it in barrels, and it was easier for them to transport east and make money on it. So they were not very happy, were they, with this new tax? They were very upset about the new tax. So, since whiskey was the major source of income for the frontier farmers, and they weren't interested in parting with some of their profits by paying this domestic tax, a certain group in western Pennsylvania, which really wasn't even in the frontier, decided in the summer of 1794 that they would tell the tax collectors to go pound sand. They weren't going to pay the tax. So, in the summer of 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania, over here, which if you look at the Appalachian Mountains, if you're in western Pennsylvania, are you on the frontier? You sure are, because here's the mountains, right? You're over here, you're on the frontier. Well, these western farmers in Pennsylvania, when they came to collect the tax on their liquor, told them to pound sand. We're not paying you any tax. Forget it. Not doing it. We're not interested in part with our profits. Well, they're making a direct threat upon who? The government of the United States. So what has to happen? What do they do? Cody, what are you going to do if you're President Washington? Your government passed this tax and the people are saying, we're not paying this tax. You're a new nation. You got to let them know who's boss. What are you going to do?
Sending troops.
What? No, what are you going to do to these people? Pay them tax? Well, they do. If you don't pay your taxes, when you get my age, you don't pay your taxes, they're just going to say, oh, that's okay, Cody, you don't have to pay your taxes. Everybody else does, you don't have to. What's going to happen if I don't pay my taxes by April 15th of next year? I'm going to get a penalty, and then if I say I'm not going to pay it, what are they going to do?
They're going to put you in jail.
They're going to put me in jail, aren't they? They're going to send an arresting officer to come over and arrest me, and they're going to put me in jail. Well, Washington sent federal marshals to western Pennsylvania to enforce that new tax law. Sent in federal marshals. Okay? Sent in law enforcement officers in there, just like if you don't pay your taxes, they'd send a federal marshal to your house and say, listen, Colt, you got to pay your taxes. You're supposed to have them paid by April 15th. You haven't paid them for the last 4 years. We've been kind of patient with you, trying to get you to pay them. It's time the rubber hits the road. We're arresting you and taking you in for tax evasion. Well, that's what they did. They sent federal marshals to western Pennsylvania to enforce the tax law. What did the farmers do when the federal marshals got there, Jordan? They did, and ran them off. They got out their guns and ran them off. That's exactly right. Sent them flying. So Washington sends in these federal marshals to enforce the new tax law, and a large group of farmers armed themselves and drove those federal marshals back to the federal government. This rebellion, this drawing of arms and running off those federal marshals, became known in American history as the Whiskey Rebellion. Okay? The Whiskey Rebellion. So Washington has got a major problem. He's trying to establish this new government, this new judicial system with laws and law enforcement officers and court systems, and he's got some people over there giving the bird to the federal government, basically. Am I right? Saying, we're not paying these taxes. They came over to get them. They ran them off with guns. So they have directly challenged the power of the newly formed federal government. Now, if you're going to have a government survive in its infancy stages, can you have your people that you live in the government tell you that they're not going to do what you tell them to do? No. So he sent the federal marshals in. So what's his next step, Ray? Who's he sending in next? He's gonna send those federal marshals back. But he's gonna send them with what? Military troops. That Washington, the President of the United States, leads himself. You think you can see the President of the United States today leading the charge in front of the military? Absolutely not. So Washington knows this is a direct challenge to the new federal government, so he sends those marshals back to enforce the law and backs them up with military troops led by himself. That's what he's saying. So as a result, Washington called out the military to assist the federal marshals in collecting the taxes. He sent 15,000 soldiers to western Pennsylvania to assist those marshals and led the charge himself. 15,000 soldiers. Well, the combination of the military force, President Washington, and the federal marshals resulted in a successful campaign. They paid their tax, and the Whiskey Rebellion ended. Okay? So, as I mentioned, the sending in of federal marshals with 15,000 troops backed with their backing and the president, they soon paid their taxes, and the Whiskey Rebellion ended. Now, this was important because the federal government made it clear that we will demonstrate our strength when necessary. Nobody's going to subvert the federal government. Yes?
What year did the rebellion end?
Oh, I don't know. Shortly after. It was within the same period of time. I wouldn't worry about that too much. As long as it took them to send the marshals out, have them sent back with their tail between their legs, and send the military out at the end. But it was very important because it was the first, the thing that's important about the Whiskey Rebellion, it was the first direct challenge to the federal government. Okay? And Washington called to the challenge. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is a summary of Alexander Hamilton's financial program. We sat here and talked about how it was Alexander Hamilton's responsibility to set up the financial well-being of this country, and it actually turned out to be a really great success. And I'm going to give you 4 reasons for Hamilton's success in restoring financial stability to the United States. You should really know these. Anyway, we'll see. So, summary of Alexander Hamilton's financial program. Alexander Hamilton's financial program did prove to be a great success, and I'm going to give you 4 reasons why Hamilton had success in restoring financial stability to the United States. Now you think about this, let's think back. What was the first thing Hamilton said that had to be done to have a successful financial program? First thing he talked about.
Pay off everything.
Thank you. Pay off our debts. So the first reason for his success was that he established that the new government had to be responsible, they had to be organized, and they had to make arrangements to pay off their foreign debt, their domestic debt, and their state debt. So the first reason for Alexander Hamilton's success in restoring financial stability to the United States was he proved that a new government had to be responsible in making arrangements to pay out their debts, foreign, domestic, and state. He made people believe that, and they did it. Okay? Because they might have to borrow money again sometime, right? What else did Alexander Hamilton do to help the financial stability of this country? He established something that, for example, provided a sound uniform currency. What did he establish that did that? The national bank system. So the second reason that Hamilton had success in restoring financial stability to the United States was he created a national bank system that provided a sound, uniform currency for the entire United States of America. Everybody used the same money. They had a place to put tax money. They had a place to transfer money instead of gold and silver. He put together a national bank system with branch banks all across the country, which really helped us financially. What else did he do? He brought on a tax system like the whiskey tax, right, to bring in revenue for the federal treasury. So he established, and this is something we didn't talk about specifically, but the third reason why his financial system was a success for the United States is he created a way to raise tax money to put in the treasury, a way to levy taxes. And the example of that I gave you was the tax on distilled liquors. So the taxes that the federal government had levied gave them revenue into the treasury, right? Because we're in debt, right? After the Revolutionary War. So he created a tax system that would put money into the federal treasury. So actually there were three, I said four, there were three reasons for his success in restoring financial stability to the United States. Number one, the new government proved to be responsible and organized, and as a result they made arrangements to pay off their foreign, domestic, and state debts. Number two, Alexander Hamilton's national bank system provided a sound, uniform currency for the federal government, gave us a place to put tax money, allowed us to transfer money without gold and silver, right? And number three, he came up with a tax system that would allow American colonists to be taxed so that money could go into the federal treasury and put us back on sound ground financially. Okay, any questions on that?
Didn't you say there was?
There's three. I said four, but there's only three. Sorry about that. Okay, now we're going to get involved in foreign affairs, things outside the country. And that's our next subtopic, which is the French Revolution and the effects on the United States. There's going to be a revolution in France, and somehow we're going to get ourselves in the middle of it. Okay? Because we have to have better foreign policy. The French Revolution and the effects on the United States.